Today it is January 22nd of 2026, and I wanted to talk about a couple of the biggest political stories that I think have happened over the last week. And one of them is, I think, way more important than a lot of people are really giving it credibility for. And no, it's not, it's not the story you think it is. But could you imagine how retarded that would be? Anyways, I wanted to start first by watching what Don Lemon had said about his reaction to the protest that he had led into the Minnesota church earlier this week.
This is the beginning of what's going to happen here. When you violate people's due process, when you pull people off the street, you start dragging them and hurting them and not abiding by the Constitution, when you start doing all of that, people get upset and angry. And if you remember what the Civil Rights Movement was about, the Civil Rights Movement was about these very kinds of protests. There's nothing in the Constitution that tells you what time you can protest. You can protest at any time. That's the whole point of it, is to disrupt, it's to make uncomfortable. And that's what they're doing. And that's what I believe when I say everyone has to be willing to sacrifice something. You have to make people uncomfortable in these times. If you see how uncomfortable people uncomfortably...
So there was really a lot to go off of with this clip, but I think Don Lemon really hit the nail on the head, actually, with addressing one of the modern problems that I've been seeing with protesting, because even to hear his understanding of what a protest is and to reference the civil rights movement as far as trying to make people uncomfortable or to create like shock value. And that's clearly what he was doing by going into the church. And what was really disgusting, I think, was him saying that he was doing all of this under the guise of journalism. He did it under the pretense of getting to the bottom of what was going on and getting the story. But these people in church were minding their own business. They weren't really affecting anything. And the goal of protests, even to look at what Martin Luther King said about protest, even if we look here at this website, as a theologian, Martin Luther King reflected often on his understanding of nonviolence. He described his own pilgrimage to nonviolence in his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, and in subsequent books and articles. True pacifism, or nonviolent resistance, King wrote, is a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. Both morally and practically committed to nonviolence, King believed that the Christian doctrine of love operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence was one of the most potent weapons available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom. King eventually decided, even here, during the boycott, King personally enacted Gandhian principles with guidance from black pacifists Baynard Rustin and Glenn Smiley of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. King eventually decided not to use armed bodyguards despite threats on his life and reacted to violent experiences such as the bombing of his home with compassion. So even the things that, Don Lemon is saying that protesting should be, and how he's justifying it by saying that, these people, these immigrants are being ripped from their homes without trial or anything like that. This is completely wrong. There are illegal immigrants in the country, and that was the mandate given by Trump through the election, was that people wanted these people deported. In no way are modern protests a representation of what Martin Luther King did. And I think it's actually disgraceful that Don Lemon tried to use this argumentation to try to justify anything that he did in that church. It's inexcusable. And I think overall there's a really important lesson to take away here, which is to not protest like Don Lemon. There's been a contortion of what protest should be, and you can see it not just with this, but even with the BLM protests in the past and climate change protests as well, where they try to make civilians or just even like works of art, these things that have nothing to really do with the core issue, they try to drag them in to their protests and try to use them as some kind of bargaining chip. But this is not the way to change people's minds. And this has been a forgotten thing, not only with protests but just in politics in general. It seems like most people are just singing to the choir at this point. No one has really that I see that's a political commentator is really good at formulating a credible argument in the space for a reason. People are just saying the things that they know that the people who agree with them want to hear, and no one is really, or I should say not, there's not no one, but there are very few people that engage in subjects in good faith. And with protests especially, and the times we're in now where there is arguably like an overreach of government authority, and I think overall the inability of protesters to have an effective protest is what is letting the government and the Trump administration kind of get these wins that should really be, I think, a more contentious debate and a more thought out conversation about what should be allowed here with the law. And I'm not really referencing anything that happened with Renee Good, as I think that while I don't think she deserved to die, I also don't think that she left the officer really any other option than what had happened. So I think really that conversation should be maybe about better training, but also there needs to be an acknowledgement of a de-escalation, because the circumstances that led up to her being in that situation were just really crazy. If you look at all the facts and you look at both sides and what happened there, there's really a credible argument for both things. There's a credible argument for better training, but there's also a credible argument for the fact that she shouldn't have been there and she shouldn't have handled that situation in the way that she did. But overall, that's the main takeaway from the Don Lemon clip, is I think this video and what he said is really the mentality that a lot of these protesters have, and I think it's destructive because a lot of people really agree with some of these topics and the things that they're fighting for, but the way they're going about fighting for, to bring awareness to climate change or to bring awareness to the things that are happening in Minnesota, I don't think a lot of people are going about it the right way. And there's not really an onus on trying to convince people or change people's minds. It's just, the method is just about beating people over the head with a stick, essentially. And it's a very brutish way of trying to get your point across, I think. But overall, I think we'll see how everything shakes out with everything in Minnesota. It just seems like things are only escalating further as the days go on. But moving forward, the most important thing and the main topic of this video was the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I wanted to react to this clip specifically because I think it was really interesting, as this is showing that I think America First, like the mindset with it, has won, at least in the Trump administration. Unanimously we are going full, we are hitting the gas on moving forward with putting American priorities first, which is a stark opposition to the direction the country has been heading in these last couple decades.
We are in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and the Trump administration and myself, we are here to make a very clear point. Globalization has failed the West and the United States of America.
Damn, Alex Jones is going to be real excited to hear about this.
It's a failed policy. It is what the WEF has stood for, which is export, offshore, far shore, find the cheapest labor in the world, and the world is a better place for it.
And he's right, I mean, you can, if you live in America especially, I mean, this has been like an ongoing conversation with countless people through my life, where you call like a call center and all of the people are not speaking English, and you can tell. Or even that story about remote workers in New York, where that barista or the cashier was working from the Philippines remotely. It's been really crazy to just see how the priority for labor has really been put on exporting. Like, they're basically outsourcing all these jobs to other countries for cheaper wages. And the real people that have been paying the price for this are the middle class, the working class Americans, because how are they supposed to get a job? They're only they're qualified to do these jobs that are being exported. And that's really creating a lot of problems as far as unemployment, the ability to, have working skills, because if you're not currently working, you're just letting those skills, rot, and it makes you less marketable when you're looking for another job if you have gaps in employment as well. Like this has led to a lot of problems overall in the American workforce.
The fact is, it has left America behind. It has left the American workers behind. And what we are here to say is that America First is a different model, one that we encourage other countries to consider, which is that our workers come first.
And this is what I meant by, I had kind of seen a little bit of this, so I had known a little bit of what he was going to say, but this is what I meant by America First has won. This mentality of putting your own country first, your citizens first, and the priorities of, of these two things. This has been, weirdly enough, it's crazy to think that this common sense approach to operating a country and a government has not really been the ethos in government for a long time until now. And I really wonder if the problems that Trump had faced during COVID with manufacturing and having to rely so much on China, I really wonder if this had put it in perspective for him. I wonder if this is what led to him coming to the conclusion that this needs to be changed, because maybe he saw how reliant we were on China, and because he saw how fragile the American economy was because of the reliance on outsourcing labor and manufacturing. I think that was a big part of why there was the shift, but also, you could also argue the growing popularity and the common sense appeal of America First and popularity of Nick Fuentes, obviously. I think all of these are huge factors when you come to try to figure out why we're doing this 180 on American global policy. And that's why I think this is so crazy, is because the significance of this and him speaking about this is that, the whole administration is on board with this mentality. They're broadly accepting it, and that's why they're talking about it on the world stage and the international stage. And this will be really interesting to see. He's making basically a sales pitch to these other countries, so it'll be interesting to see if these other countries are receptive to it, and if they think that, if they're going to adopt these same changes that America will, because, this America First approach and putting your citizens first, this is automatically going to flip the table on what has been the norm for international politics, where there has been this mutual goal. Now he's basically saying you should put your own priorities first, and how everyone will fit into the puzzle now after this if they adopt this mentality. This is the shakeup that I'm talking about. This is very significant.
We can have policies that impact our workers. Sovereignty is your borders. You're entitled to have borders. You shouldn't offshore your medicine. You shouldn't offshore your semiconductors. You shouldn't offshore your entire industrial base and have it be hollowed out beneath you.
I think honestly that's a reference to China. I think maybe I think I hit the nail on the head with the COVID and the issues with manufacturing and having to deal with China to the extent that he did, and Operation Lightspeed. I think that was a really big catalyst for Trump really waking up to the idea that this globalist approach has not been working. And let me go back. He said something else that I also thought that was pretty interesting, that I wanted to talk about.
Your semiconductors. You shouldn't offshore your entire industrial base and have it be hollowed out beneath you. You should not be dependent for that which is fundamental to your sovereignty on any out beneath you, your entire industrial, your semiconductors. You shouldn't.
I think it was about borders.
Your medicine. You shouldn't offshore your semiconductors. You shouldn't offshore you're entitled to have borders. You shouldn't.
Yeah. So this comment about borders, I think this was a pretty much like he was being pretty blunt about calling out like the UK and just really these European countries that have had this issue with immigration. And You see this apparatus online of the mainstream news trying to defend the immigration that is going on there, but especially if you go on like Twitter or YouTube, especially in the comments, a lot of people are very opposed to the almost open borders immigration that has been going on there, and it has seemingly made the country worse, as there have been a lot of problems and just breaches of really common sense law and like free speech. And I know that doesn't necessarily apply to England, but it's just been really crazy to see the things going on there, as far as people being arrested just for even criticizing what's going on there. And I think if you're an American, it's really easy to see how lucky we are having these laws that protect our free speech. And it's a really good case study, I think, or an example to see how if we didn't have free speech laws, how things could degrade very quickly. And I really hope that I hope that the leaders that are here and listening to this, to him talking about all these things, I hope they're at least willing to listen and entertain the things that he's talking about, because I think that, unless things are reversed in those countries, I think it will only get a lot worse. But we'll see what happens.
Which is fundamental to your sovereignty on any other nation. And if you're going to be dependent on someone, it darn well better be your best allies. Okay? And so that is a different way of thinking. It is completely different than the WEF. I viewed the WEF as not a flagpole in the middle, but in fact, they are the flag. Whichever way the wind blew, so it blew. You should have solar, you should have wind.
And what he's basically talking about is that the WEF, the World Economic Forum, the consensus that this organization had basically dictated the direction of the world. Even though they tried to be, this ambiguous, like neutral thing, I mean, it obviously wasn't. It's like the whole world has been heading in this direction of globalism. We have all been offsourcing our labor to third world countries. We've been relying on China. We've been relying on, Thailand for semiconductors. Manufacturing has moved overseas, even like the car industry being hurt in America. All of these things have really suffered because of the prioritization of moving these to external countries and offsourcing the labor and the industry to these other countries, allowing their economies to grow while we have only become more and more reliant on them. And again, going back to the China example, that was Operation Lightspeed. That was where, Trump was relying on China for, I believe, the masks was one thing. Medical supplies, a bunch of different stuff, and they were having really bad supply chain issues because we weren't able to make any of that stuff here. And that's what he's referring to by sovereignty. True sovereignty is independence. That's not relying on anyone else. If you're like a father, or if you're a mother and you have a family, you're not relying on other people other than your closest allies, your immediate family. And that's really what he's talking about here, is he's talking about consolidation of power and seeking of self-interest. That's really what he's advocating for.
Why are you going to do solar and wind? Why would Europe agree to be net zero in 2030 when they don't make a battery? They don't make a battery. So if they go 2030,
it's crazy because he's right. It's like, how can you obtain zero carbon emissions when you're not even making an alternative fuel source? And I think that's what he means by this example of the battery. What are you going to do when the whole world is built to rely on oil and gas? It's not realistic. And even when you talk about like the transference to nuclear power or alternative sources of fuel, we need to have the infrastructure to do that. And I think while people say that we could move forward with doing it, I think the main problem is that we haven't started. And I don't really know the reason for why that is, but I think overall, if people saw that there was a credible alternative fuel source, I think they would at least get started on placing the infrastructure down, because that would take so much time. So that thought process kind of leads me to think that maybe there hasn't been a good enough fuel alternative to oil and gas that has been discovered. There has not been one that is as effective, that would warrant replacing, our whole infrastructure to accommodate it. But that's basically the point that he's making here, is that, we are not independent sovereign countries. We are more interconnected and more interdependent, and that has led to a weakness because of that. And whether you agree with this or not, I think he makes a good argument on some of the shortcomings that we've seen with globalism. And, I hesitate to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to really a lot of topics, because sometimes people want to use, how we've been operating as America as an example of globalism, when there's other self-interest involved, there's corruption. It's like, to say that we have been operating under a perfect example of globalism is, I think, disingenuous, as you have other interests that have manipulated that process, or have subverted the way that globalism could have benefited the country. For example, I will use this as far as like taxes. Clearly, everyone is not paying their taxes. Otherwise, we would not be in a deficit in the country as far as our collection. We know that companies are skirting taxes. There are multiple laws and there are ways to avoid paying taxes. So to just assume that, everyone is paying their fair share, or this is a perfect representation of what globalism is, I think, disingenuous. But my point is to say that, I think there are actually criticisms that we've actually learned within the multiple years that our country has been going this way, and I think he's right to call that out. But I wish he would go about saying it in that way, but that's like a minor nitpick on my end. I just think that most of the time in politics, people have an all or nothing approach, when realistically it's like there's usually good and bad with most things. And to pretend that it's completely, it wasn't working based on how we were doing it, therefore it doesn't work, is, I think, disingenuous. Maybe we just weren't doing it the right way, or with a few certain tweaks, maybe this would have been a good direction for the country. Who knows? That's really my point.
They are deciding to be subservient to China, who makes the batteries.
Yeah, I mean, the clip is over, but overall, I think it's pretty obvious that we learned a few lessons, or Trump learned lessons about being reliant, and I think Trump really woke up to the shortcomings of globalism based on what happened with COVID. And to hear them talk about it at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, is crazy, because like I said, this just means that everyone is on board with moving forward with America First. This is the direction the country will be heading into the future, and it will be interesting to see if future politicians will continue this mentality, because I think what Trump is really starting to do is start off a multi-administration plan. And what I mean by that is that for his plan to succeed, everything he is laying the groundwork for now, this will require his successor, like a J.D. Vance, to be on the same page and to have the same mentality of America First. And I think that it will be interesting to see what will happen because of this. What if a Democrat gets into office? Will they continue the same mentality? Will we go 180 and will we go back towards more globalistic policies? How will other countries respond to, now that they basically have a directive from a world superpower that they should be going after their self-interests? This is a really big shakeup of international politics, and it's the likes of which I think we haven't seen in a long time. But overall, I think this is a really interesting topic, and it will be really interesting to see how things shake out moving forward. But yeah, overall, if you made it this far and if you liked the video, please consider leaving a comment whether you agree or disagree, or just have any interesting insights, because that's the main reason I want to make these videos, is just because I like talking about stuff like this. And I think if you can zoom out from politics and not take it as seriously, it's a crazy time to really be looking at everything. But yeah, have a good one, and please stay safe.